There is a point in a builder's journey that matters far more than most people realize it. And it's not the moment where everything looks impressive from the outside, not the moment where people start recognizing you, and not even the moment where things feel big. It's much earlier, much quieter, almost easy to overlook if you're only focused on visible success. It's one of the moments someone pays you. Not as encouragement, not as a compliment, not as a validation in words, but real money for something you built, something you created, something that came from your effort, your thinking, your ability to turn something internal into something real. And maybe it's not a large amount. Maybe it's your first $50 or your first 100 or even your first 1,000. On paper, that doesn't look impressive. It doesn't completely change your life. I get it. It doesn't give you the freedom you desire, or it doesn't solve all the problems you have, but something shifts anyway. And that shift is not external, it's internal, it's structural, it's in your psychology. Before that moment, everything you are doing still sits in some kind of uncertainty. You are building without confirmation. You're putting in the time, the energy, the effort, sometimes even your emotional weight into something that hasn't fully answered you back yet. It feels like movement, absolutely. And in a sense, it is, but it's still contained inside your own perception. You can believe it works, you can hope it works, you can imagine where it could go, but you don't yet have proof that it connects to reality. And that creates a very specific kind of tension. Not loud, not dramatic, but constant. It sits underneath everything you do. Questions that don't fully go away. Am I wasting my time? Does this actually matter? Would anyone ever pay for this? Is this real or am I just convincing myself? And even if you don't say those questions out loud, they influence how you move. They influence how consistent you are, how long you stay, and how much you trust the process. And this is where most people quietly fall off, not because they lack ability, not because they choose the wrong path, but because they never cross the point where reality answers back. They stay in effort without confirmation for too long, and eventually that becomes heavy because the mind wants feedback. It wants something solid. It wants some kind of signal that what you are doing is not just contained in your own head. And if that signal doesn't come or doesn't come fast enough, doubt slowly fills that space. That is why the first money you make matters, not because of the amount, but because of what it represents. It is the first undeniable signal that something you created has value outside of your perception. It is the moment where your internal world connects with external reality in a measurable way. Someone saw what you made, understood it, and then decided it was worth something for them. That's not theory anymore. That's not potential. That is living proof. And that proof changes everything. Because once that happens, even at a small level, something inside you recalibrates. You're no longer operating purely on belief. You now have evidence, not the perfect evidence, but now something enough, something that gives you enough to shift your perspective, right? The question, does this work at all, starts losing its power because now it has already worked at least once. And that one time matters more than people think because it breaks a psychological barrier that holds most people back for years. Before that moment, everything feels fragile. And after that moment, things start feeling possible in a different way. You begin to see that there is a path, even if it's not clear yet. You begin to understand that this is not just something for other people, it's something that can happen through your own. And that changes how you relate to your work. You stop treating it like something optional. You stop seeing it as something you try when you feel like it, and you start seeing it as something that can compound, something that can grow, something that deserves your consistency, your attention, and your focus. And this is where the shift from casual effort to real building begins. A lot of people miss this moment because they are too focused on bigger numbers. They look at the first $100 they made and dismiss it. They say like something like, it's nothing. It doesn't count. It's too small. But that thinking is short-sighted because the first $100 is not about the money. It's about the mechanism. It proves that the system you built works. It proves that value can be created, communicated, and exchanged. It proves that there is a connection between what you do and what reality gives you back. And once you understand this, I can't stress this enough. The question is no longer, can this work? It becomes, how do I make this work again? And that is a completely different level of thinking. That's where you move from identity questions into operational questions, from doubt into process, from uncertainty into iteration. And this is where early money becomes more than just financial, it becomes informational. It tells you something about reality that you cannot learn through thinking alone. It shows you where your effort actually connects, not where you think it connects, not where you want it to connect, but where it actually lands. And that feedback is extremely valuable, especially early on, because a lot of builders are attached to their ideas. They have a vision of what they want to create, what they want to be known for, what they believe should work. But reality doesn't respond to what you believe should work. It responds to what actually creates value for someone else. And sometimes those two things don't fully align in the beginning. That's where the first money can be surprising. It might come from something you didn't expect, something you underestimated, maybe a skill you didn't think was valuable, a way of explaining something that felt natural to you but meaningful to someone else. And suddenly, reality shows you something about yourself you didn't see fully before. And that is such an important moment because it pulls you out of the assumption and into clarity. It shows you where to look. It gives you some kind of direction. And direction is far more useful than motivation because motivation comes and goes, but direction stabilizes actions. And once you have even a small amount of direction, you can start building more intentionally. You can start asking better questions. Not something like, what should I do? But why did this work? What actually created this result? What part of this can I improve? What part of this can I repeat? And this is where things start becoming more structured because now you're not just working hard, you're working with feedback. And that is what turns effort into progress. Another thing that changes after the first money is your relationship to time. Before proof, time can feel uncertain. You invest hours, days, weeks, maybe even years without knowing if it will lead somewhere. And that makes it harder to stay consistent, harder to stay focused because there is no anchor yet. But after proof, time starts feeling different. You start seeing your time as something that can produce results, not immediately, not guaranteed, but realistically. And that changes how you use it. You become more intentional. You waste less energy on things that don't matter. You start prioritizing actions that connect to outcomes. And this is where a lot of people either accelerate or stall. Because once you have proof, you have two options. You can take it seriously, study it, build on it, and move forward with more clarity, or you can ignore it, dismiss it, and fall back into random effort. And the difference between these two paths becomes very visible over time. The people who built something real are not the ones who had the best ideas from the beginning. They are the ones who paid attention to small signals early. The ones who respected early proof. The ones who treated small results as something to learn from, not something to overlook. Because scale doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows out of something small that worked. And if you don't take the small things seriously, you never reach the next level. That's why the first $1,000 matters. Not because of what it gives you, but because of what it shows you. It shows you that this is real. It shows you that this is possible. And most importantly, it shows you that this can be repeated. And that's where the next stage begins. Once you have crossed that first threshold, once you've seen that something you created can produce a real result, the game changes completely. But not in the way most people expect it. A lot of people think everything becomes easier after the first money. That confidence suddenly stabilizes, the direction becomes obvious, that momentum just carries you forward automatically. But that's not what happens. I'm sorry to disappoint you. What actually happens is more subtle and in some ways more demanding. You move from the question, can this work, into the question, can I build this consistently? And that is a completely different challenge because one result proves possibility, but consistency requires structure, awareness, and repetition under less ideal conditions. One result can still be accidentally. It can be timing, luck, context, a moment where something aligned just enough. But consistency forces you to understand what actually created that result. It forces you to look deeper. What actually made this valuable? What problem did I solve? Why did someone say yes instead of ignoring it? What part of my thinking, my positioning, my communication actually connected? And most people don't slow down enough to answer those questions. They get a result, they feel good for a moment, and then they move on too quickly, chasing the next thing instead of extracting the lesson from the first thing. But builders don't just chase results. And if you're watching this, I consider you as a builder. They study them because inside every small win, there is a structure. And if you don't understand that structure, you cannot repeat it. And if you cannot repeat it, you are not building yet. You're just experiencing random outcomes. This is where the difference between random progress and intentional building becomes very clear. Random progress feels exciting. It gives you moments of validation, but it doesn't compound. Intentional building is slower at first, sometimes even frustrating, because it requires you to pause, to reflect, to analyze, to refine. But that is what creates something stable over time. That is what turns a moment into a system. And this is where most people unconsciously split into two paths. One group keeps chasing new ideas, new angles, new directions, and always looking for something that feels better, something that feels easier, something that feels more right. And the other group that takes what worked, even if it's small, even if it's imperfect, and they go deeper into it. They refine it, they test it again, and they adjust small parts of it. They improve slightly, and then they repeat. And over time, the second group, they are going the one path that compounds, because building is not about constantly finding something new. It's about recognizing something that already works and staying with it long enough to make it stronger. And that requires discipline, but not the kind people usually think of. Not forced discipline, not intensity, but focused repetition. The ability to do something again, even if it's not exciting anymore, because you understand that repetition is what creates depth. This is where another important shift happens. You start separating what feels good from what actually works. In the beginning, those two things are often confusing. You follow what feels interesting, what feels aligned, motivating. But once you have proof, you start seeing that not everything that feels good produces results, and that not everything that produces results feels exciting. And if you don't learn to prioritize function over feeling, you will constantly drift. The mind is drawn to novelty. It wants new ideas, new direction, new stimulations, but real building often looks repetitive from the outside. You're doing similar things again, refining small details, improving execution, tightening clarity, adjusting positioning. And that doesn't always feel inspiring, but it works. And this is one thing I've seen over and over again. This is the moment where many people unintentionally sabotage themselves. They get their first result, and instead of building on it, they abandon it too early. They think this was just a small thing, or I want something bigger, or something like this doesn't fully represent me yet. So they move on, and then they lose the one thing that actually had traction. And they start over. They try something new again and again, always active, always moving, but never accumulating. And that's one of the most dangerous patterns in the early builders phase because it feels like progress. You're doing something, you're trying things, you're exploring, but nothing compounds because nothing is had long enough to develop. I have seen so many great people out there with such intentional ideas, but they didn't stick to it long enough. And that's so sad because they had would have made so a big difference in this world. This is the message I want to give you. So real builders understand that small traction is not something to leave. It's something to stay with. You need to stick to it. They don't ask, is this big enough? They ask, is it real? And if it's real, then build on it, please. Even if it's small, even if it's simple, even if it doesn't look impressive yet. Because real builders understand something most people miss. Scale is hidden inside small signals, not in big ideas, not in a perfect plan, but in small things that already work in reality. And this is where patience become a completely different skill. Earlier, patience meant staying long enough to get your first result. Now, patience means staying long enough to turn that result into something repeatable. And that's harder because now you already experience a win. And the mind wants more of that feeling. This is a dopamine hit. It wants bigger results, quicker growth, visible progress. But the process doesn't speed up just because you want it to. That's very important to know. You still have to build it step by step, iteration by iteration. And this is where your relationship with results needs to change. Before your first money results feel like validation, they feel like proof that you are on the right path. They carry emotional weight. But after your first money, if you approach it correctly, results become data, not something to attach your identity to, but something to learn from. Because if every result defines how you feel about yourself, you become unstable. You will overreact to wins, you will overreact to losses, and your consistency will suffer from it. But if you see results as information, you stay grounded, you stay focused, you become less reactive and more intentional. And that is what allows you to keep building even when things are not perfect, because they won't be. There will be periods where things slow down, where results are inconsistent, where something that worked before doesn't work the same way again, where your output feels off or where your clarity drops. And if you don't expect that, it will shake you. It will make you questioning everything again. But if you understand that this is a part of the process, you don't need to panic. You just simply adjust. You refine, you continue. And that is what separates people who build something real from people who stay in cycles. Another important shift I want you to get is how you relate to your effort. In the beginning, effort feels heavy because it's not yet connected to results. After proof, effort becomes more directed. You start seeing where your time actually matters. You start noticing which actions move things forward and which ones don't. And that allows you to reduce noise. Because not everything deserves your attention. Not everything deserves your time. And one of the biggest mistakes people make after their first success is trying to do too much, expanding too quickly, adding complexity before stability, trying to scale something they don't fully understand yet. And that creates fragility. Instead of growing something strong, they stretch something weak. But as you have already learned through these videos, real builders do the opposite. They simplify. They focus, they remove what doesn't matter, and they double down on what does. Because clarity reduces friction, and reduced friction makes consistency easier. And consistency is what builds momentum, not intensity, not burst of motivation, but steady, repeated action aligned with what actually works. This is where building starts to feel different. Not necessarily easy, but more grounded, less emotional, more structured, less reactive, more intentional. You're no longer trying to prove that this is possible. You're working on making it better. And that is a more stable place to operate from. So if you zoom out of this whole picture, the first $1,000 are not important because of the money itself. They are important because it marks a transition from speculation to reality, from guessing to feedback, from identity to process. And once you cross that line, your responsibility changes. You can no longer treat this like an experiment. You have seen that it works. Now the question is whether you're willing to build it. So instead of asking what's the next big move, ask something simpler and more powerful. What worked and how can I do it again? Understand the structure, refine the execution, repeat the process, stay with it longer than it feels comfortable, because that's how something small turns into something real. Not through sudden breakthroughs, but through quiet accumulation, through taking small proof seriously, through staying when others move on, through building when it's no longer exciting but still meaningful. And if you can do that, if you can stay in that phase without constantly looking for something else, without constantly restarting, without chasing something bigger, then something starts to form. Not immediately, but inevitably. And that's the difference between trying to build and actually building.